All right. That being said, I'd like to welcome Adam Vines tonight. So Adam is the director of creative writing at UAB, where he teaches poetry and literature. He has published poetry in Poetry, Southwest Review, the Kenyon Review, Gulf Coast, Barrow Street, the Cincinnati Review, 32 Poems, the Literary Review, 5 Points, Ecotone, the Hopkins Review, Verse Daily, and Poetry Daily, and others. He is the author of 3 single-authored books of poetry, Lures, Out of Speech, and The Coal Life, and 2 collaborative poetry collections written with Allen Jih Day Kink, and According to Discretion. He is the editor of Birmingham Poetry Review. And you can get all of his books available at Thank You Books. So he has several just wonderful titles, wonderful covers, and our most recent edition, Birmingham Poetry Review, is available there as well. So that being said, take it away, Adam.
Hey, everybody. How's everyone doing? I wanted everyone to have a voice tonight because I can't stand lecturing, and I love for my workshops to be discussion based. So I want to learn from you as hopefully you learn something from me. Tonight, we're going to talk about the architecture of poems, especially poems that we adore. A lot of times we read poems over and over that we love, and we read them for the content. We read them for a few of the lines, but I'm not sure that we go through and annotate and really figure out how that poem's functioning and how we can use that to our advantage as a poet. Robert Frost said that good poets borrow and great poets steal. So tonight is going to be an exercise in pilfering from the poets. And we're going to have a bit of literary blasphemy here as well. I'm going to show you a couple of poets that I really admire, and we're going to look at a couple of the poems and close read those poems, talk about the architecture, the framework, the scaffolding of the poem, what underlies it prosodically, what underlies it formally, without even really talking about the subject matter, and then talking about how the subject matter is accentuated by that architecture. And then we'll do an exercise where we steal that architecture. We steal that linear trajectory or the haphazard trajectory that we have in the poem, and we impose upon that with whatever subject matter or context we can think of. First, we're going to start off with a poem by Claudia Emerson. Claudia Emerson passed away, I guess, about 6 or 7 years ago. She was a close friend of mine. I think she died at 54 years old. She struggled with cancer for about 3 or 4 years, and during that time, she published 3 or 4 books of poems and had 2 books that came out posthumously. So she worked through her struggle. This is one of her earlier collections, Figure Studies, or the poem that I'm going to read is from one of her earlier poems, Figure Studies. And it comes from the section, The All Girls School. Claudia became a poet late, came to writing late, and she had all kinds of jobs in Virginia. One was she was a rural mail carrier, and one job that she held was as a teacher at a private school, an all-girls private school. This comes from that section in the book, and I'm going to read it out loud, and then we're going to talk about it. Orchid Anatomy. The evenings study the anatomy of the orchid. The greenhouse glows, jet of glass at the 3rd story of the science building. Small, tended jungle thriving in its humid room. Wearing identical lab aprons, they lean over the misting table or peer into the daintier air orchids in order to name and sketch the parts, committing to memory the sepal's inner whirl of petals, the column where male and female fuse, and the sticky, stigmatic surface of the pouting lip where birds, moths, and bees would land if allowed this sterile world. Each wall, even the vaulted roof, a canvas. All their breathing dissolves into the ordered atmosphere of this one sustained season, until, if seen from the outside, the glasses weeping would render them recognizable, but changed, their bodies, braids, aprons, the green leaves running into a pleasing, impressionistic bleed. All right, let's first talk about the form. We've got couplets, right? Longer lines. We have a title that's a subject matter title, right? Or is it a subject matter and a title that's leaning toward the figurative as well? Orchid anatomy. What would you say? How does that lead us into the poem? Does it lead us in purely through subject matter, purely one-dimensionally that way? Or does it give us a sense of some kind of subtext? When we think of anatomy, when we think of anatomical structures, are we thinking more of plants, or are we thinking more of, or is it flora and fauna, or more fauna than flora? Somebody speak up, or I'm gonna have to start throwing the butter sock.
Usually anatomy, I think of the human body more than I really think of plants or animals.
Exactly, and that's the kind of fusion that I think Claudia was going for here, that one would resonate from the other, so that we have orchid in the place of the specialized plant, right? We know it's a flower, we know it's a delicate flower, we know it's one flower and it's a specialized flower. And then anatomy, we go into the clinical as well, right? It's not body, it's not flesh, it's anatomy. We think of anatomy class. We think of being in a lab. We may even think of cadavers, right? We may think, especially when we start talking about canvases and we go into impressionism toward the end, the impressionistic blend. You know, it's supposed to resonate impression, but also the movement and painting that spawned out of the French parlor painters and people wanting to express beyond just the realistic. So we have that blending in the beginning, bleeding into the first lines. Now let's talk about the first line of the poem. I'd like for someone to read the first line itself for me.
This evening's study the anatomy of the orchid.
Okay, let's talk about that line. The syntax seems kind of wonky, right? You probably looked at the line and you had to look at it maybe even twice before you read it out loud because you weren't sure where to pause. Seems like there's an attenuation here. There's something has been left on and we're left with a liaison, right? It's not, it could be the evening study is the anatomy of the orchid, you know? Maybe the is kind of left out so that we have this quickened nature of syntax in that first line. Or it could just be a fragment that's leading into the first full sentence, which is the greenhouse glows, where we have a very simple article, subject, and then verb there, and then a quick dash. Either way, it's difficult to get through that first line, isn't it? I think all of us would go back and reread that first line. And ordinarily, I would say, boy, what a poor rhetorical move there, you know? You don't want to confuse someone, and the reader shouldn't have to go back on that first line, right? The first line is what? It's a doorway, right? It's either closed, it's cracked, it's open full. The title sometimes opens the door for us, and then we're led inside for that first line. Here, it's distracting in a way. I'd love for someone to make the argument for why that distraction would be a good thing for a poem like this, given the context. Sophia?
I find it interesting because I write fiction and I do some editing for science fiction, and we're always challenging people, don't allow the reader to leave the fictive bubble. But yeah. I think the opposite is true in this case in poetry. You want your reader to read and reread and try to figure it out. That's not what you're going for in fiction. But in poetry, you want them to struggle with it, to wrestle with what is the true meaning, or what is the meaning for me or the author.
Yeah, and if this is if this is the opening image, the evening study, the anatomy of the orchid, the great irony though is that we're just kind of saying what's in the title anyway, right? Is there a redundancy there? Orchid anatomy and then anatomy of the orchid, it's just a lengthening of that, where you throw the orchid into the object of the preposition, which then weakens that image, right? So that's what I mean about being blasphemous. Claudia Emerson has probably had as big an impression on me as anyone in my writing. And the poems that we love and the writers that we love, sometimes we have to find fault with them. Even someone like Claudia, who has won the Pulitzer Prize. It's difficult for us to do as writers. It's difficult for us to do as critics, because we all think to ourselves, how do I know better than this person? What am I missing here? But I would like for us to look at these first few lines, and then we can hopefully progress as writers by looking at ways that we could make this opening more effective. What has been put in here that doesn't need to be in here? What kind of opening do we need after a subject matter title that also brings in anatomical structures, which is the subtext of the poem, right? We have orchids, but what's the subtext? It's the they, the collective noun of these young girls who are left in a perpetual sphere also, as if they're in a greenhouse and they're in this perpetual, almost, well, it's a perpetual but stagnant prepubescent state. They're not allowed to grow. They're not allowed to blossom. This is just one poem out of this section, but that's a thematic element or a leitmotif in this section. The evening study, the anatomy of the orchid. The greenhouse glows, jet of glass at the third story of the science building. Small, tended jungle thriving in its humid room. All right, we're going to go to the end of what I think is the opening of the poem, which could be discarded completely, maybe. Maybe we could start at wearing identical lab aprons, they. However, then that changes the they, which are the women, from being subordinated here to being the primary thrust of the poem, right? And there's a reason that she wants them to be secondary to the orchids, so that there can be a transference there where we're talking about the orchids, but yet we're transferring all of that description, all of that kind of lack of metamorphosis upon the girls who are tending these orchids or looking at their anatomical structures in this biology class, in this greenhouse where nothing changes, right? Think about a greenhouse metaphorically. It is constantly the growing season, right? It's constantly one temperature. It constantly has a particular kind of humidity that's perfect for these plants to thrive. These girls themselves, which in the confines of these walls of this private girls' school, in the same manner, Claudia is arguing in this book, they are in this place where there is no entropy. There is no breaking down. There is no chaos. It's ordered. Nature is chaotic, right? Sure, there are cycles of nature, but it's all chaos working towards those universal cycles. These girls aren't allowed the chaos either. They are patterned. They are dressed alike. They go to classes together. They're placed within the sphere where they're looking at stamens, pistils, the male and female fusing, right? But what isn't allowed in there? The moth, the bee, the bird. If you look at classical literature, in classical literature, images are almost always gendered. And where you have flowers, you always have a secondary notion of female genitalia, and it's always gendered female. The bee itself, right? The one that comes by and takes the pollen on the legs and then goes from place to place is always gendered male here. We don't have the male here. We have the orchid itself, but it contains everything within it. So how can we change those first that first sentence so that we have a clearer opening.
I mean, just literally, not
Yeah,
poetic.
literally. Yeah. What do
The
we cut out of here?
The anatomy of the orchid was this evening's study.
The anatomy of the orchid was this evening study. Yes, from a prose writer, that would be the way to switch around the syntax so that it's very clear, right? Is there a way that we could take out that to be verb so that we could have a more active verb in there? And maybe so that we could have a line break that breaks along that verb. Because if you look at the lines, did all of you notice that every one of these lines is jammed? All of the sentences start within the line. They don't start at the beginning of a line and they don't end at the end of a line. It's meant to be breathless in that way, right? So that we're forced over lines, so that we're forced to have white space between us, right? In between our thoughts, in between the narrative, in between the juxtaposition of imagery. So the anatomy of the orchid was this evening's study. Do we even need that? That's just that's almost like a mini thesis, isn't it? An abstract for the poem. Instead of starting in the middle, then we have an abstract. That would be the easiest way to do it. Was that KK who talked? I think I heard her voice. Yeah. I mean, that would be the easiest way to do it and the clearest way to do it. How about the jut of glass at the third story of the science building? Why is that important? It's a really important image because what comes at the end, right? Doesn't the glass come back in the end? The young women themselves don't metamorphose, do they? It's only through the weeping of the glass, right? Where someone could look through and see them and they have been altered, like an impressionistic blend, right? A mixing, a blending, the impression of change, the impression of blossom, the impression of fusion, but not the actuality of it, right? In this section, and just like in this poem, everything is given the possibility to blossom. Everything is given the possibility to come to fruition, but it's always in a holding pattern. The perfect image here, the perfect conceit here is the greenhouse. So I would say that it might even be better to start out with just a simple sentence like the greenhouse glows. We're placed immediately there, right? Do we need the small tended jungle? And what's wrong with the words tended jungle? A lot of times we don't think about these combinations of adjectives and nouns.
They're
It's
sort of
oxymoronic.
contradictory.
Yeah, it's oxymoronic. It's contradictory. You can't have a tended jungle, can you? No, once it's tended, what does it become? A garden. It becomes domesticated. It becomes shackled. It's been controlled. Instead of chaos, it's in control, right? Something is controlling it. Now, she would argue, and I would argue too, that is how she is bringing or bridging the gap. She's bringing the chaos and the order together there in that. However, it does seem oxymoronic. Small tended jungle thriving in its humid room. My argument to her, and being a blasphemer like I am, I would say that that needs to go. I would rather see that expressed in the local so that it evokes that idea instead of being told that from the very beginning. Just like that very first sentence where we almost have to throw a to be verb in to make sense of it. I don't think that it's effective or that it's a exciting way to open up a poem like this, or for the narrative, for the rhetorical structure, and for the poetic music, I would cut that line out completely for the sake of. Wearing identical lab aprons, they lean over the misting table. That takes a lot of guts too, doesn't it? Because we don't have an antecedent for the day, do we? It's just a pronoun. It's a collected pronoun, a generalized pronoun. Makes it almost scientific, right? Empirical. They lean over the misting table or peer into the daintier air orchids. What if it said the young women? How would that change the effect there? It would embody them, right? Then we would think anatomy, anatomical structures. But to leave them disembodied, I think, is a clever, clever move here. Because they are disembodied, then everything that we see after that, when it comes to the orchids, we then transfer to these girls as well. That's how text and subtext start piggybacking one another. In order to name and sketch the parts, committing to memory the sepal's inner whirl of petals. So what are they committing to memory? The anatomical structures, the names of them, so they can identify them, right? What aren't they doing? What should they be seeing in that flower, in the interior landscape of that flower? Young women at the cusp of pubescence. They should be seeing themselves, right? They should be learning something about themselves. These are the reproductive parts of the flower, right? Inner whirl of petals, the column where male and female, and then we start getting into almost hyper poetic language. I just want you to listen to the oral qualities of this. And female fuse and the sticky stigmatic surface. Do you see how we have the fricatives and then the sibilants there? The f and the s comes from the same area for those of you who have taken linguistics classes, and the f, s. The column where male and female fuse and the sticky stigmatic surface. Do you see how phonetically the language itself is expressing the nature of the imagery? However, they are doing what? They are in a sterilized room, essentially, where they are looking at these things and they're jotting down names, probably Latin names even. They're jotting down the anatomy of this thing. There's no self-reflection there. There's no absorption of what this thing is and how it relates to me. Of the pouting lip, you see even there how she's brought in the anatomy of the human into what? The flower. The pouting lip, where birds, moths, and bees would land if allowed this sterile world. Which they won't be, right? Again, perpetually fecund, but perpetually dislocated. Each wall, even the vaulted roof, a canvas, and then art's introduced, right? Or artifice, not life, right? So this place isn't like a real place where things grow, where people blossom. It's a canvas. It's artifice. It's a representation of life. All their breathing dissolves into the ordered atmosphere. And do you see how the they becomes collective again? All of their breathing becomes one, unified, as if they are this collective they, if they are this collected, this collected body, atmosphere of this one sustained season. And that's the counterfeit season, right? We don't get what we know in nature. What can we count on with nature? Well, until climate change creates one season and we just fry. in hot oil. But we have faith that seasons are going to change. There's a dying season and there is a growing season. And there are two of these tertiary seasons, right? These in-betweens, these tweeners, where you can have growth and you can have dying at the same time. Until, if seen from the outside, the glass is weeping. And the weeping there, of course, means literally what it's doing, which is weeping. And what is that weeping literally?
Like the condensation from inside.
Exactly, the condensation, then it starts to roll. But the weeping there, is, of course, is supposed to have some emotive, we're supposed to have some emotive response to it, some emotive connection to it. Weeping would render them recognizable, but changed. So the only way they can change is through what? The altering, in the same way that Impressionism altered realism, right? And why did the Impressionists, what was the reactionary movement against the parlor painters that preceded the Impressionists? What were the Impressionists' goal? What were they trying to express? Let's look at Monet's haystacks or cathedrals. If you have 10 or 12 paintings, and each one is supposed to be an expression of a time of day, and through that time of day, a kind of emotional representation as well.
They wanted to express essence instead of accuracy.
Exactly. Essence instead of accuracy. So the essence of these they, we haven't even embodied them, right? She didn't call them girls. I had to kind of tell you that, right? Or students. I mean, this poem, it's a lovely poem, but it's a difficult poem to read outside of this section of poems because it is building on it. You know, and there are poems like that in a collection. They're difficult to read individually, but completely necessary for a section. It's just like breaking a chapter away from a novel. You just can't do that, even though that chapter on its own wouldn't make any sense. Render them recognizable, but changed. Their bodies, braids, aprons. And we have them and their. And before then, what are we talking about with the thems? If you look for an antecedent, we have to go where? To the lilies. Do you see how they become interchangeable? We're forced to transfer the concrete from the lilies, all of those ideas associated with the lilies upon the them and the theys and the theirs. Bodies, braids, aprons, the green leaves. Do you see how in that cataloging too, they're all put together? They're put together in the syntax, in a list. The green leaves running into a pleasing, impressionistic bleed. And it's not a muddling, right? It's a bleed. Something bleeding onto canvas, something bleeding into one another, where these two things can only occupy the same space here in this one area, in this almost bubble boy kind of atmosphere. Remember the bubble boy with John Travolta from the 70s? That's what this is. I mean, it is a place that defies entropy, that defies breakdown and chaos, where everything can be controlled. It's climate controlled. It's emotionally controlled. It's clinically sterile. Everything is anatomically presented. Now, what can we learn from a poem like this on how we could approach a poem in a similar way? Or it could be a reactionary poem. Many of my poems come from a stance of reaction, so that I'm not wanting to actually steal what someone's done, but I'm looking at things that they've done and recognize that maybe they skipped a step, or maybe they accelerated when they should have hit the brakes, or maybe they should have peeled out in their 70 Mach 1 Mustang in between the two stop signs instead of stopping in the middle of the street, getting out and pouring out their beer. Those are all metaphors for how lines move, how friction can create nuance and subject matter. Instead of the anatomy of an orchid, what could you change to? What could you change that context to? It could be a locker room. It could be a waiting room at a doctor. How many of you have read Elizabeth Bishop's poem about the waiting room? How many of you have read Revelation by Flannery O'Connor? A lot can happen in a waiting room. Books can be thrown. Where else could this take place? In a bathroom. Can you see how the people, though, can be secondary, and then toward the end, it flip-flops so that you have the underpinnings, which is the human presence and the human drama. It's informed by imagery of the natural world. And then at the end, Claudia pulls a bed trick on us and flips those collective pronouns and then blends the two, where we have the green leaves, we have the braids and the aprons and the bodies. It's not till the end that she says body, right? And when she says body and bleed, I think that we're impressed upon something as well there too. The chance for maturation, right? That these girls are going to mature perhaps, or they're given the opportunity through this impressionistic lens, but not through the only viable lens that most people have. But it's only through looking, almost squinty-eyed that you can see that they have the propensity for maturity. All right, let's go on to the next poem. This is a poem by Hastings Hensel, who might be our last Viking poet. This, like the last poem, is a narrative poem, but it's balancing both the lyrical and the narrative. Pumping the trout's stomach. Almost like laughter in a silent film, that soundless gasping prompted when my father showed me how to pump the trout's stomach. So with each laugh, the fish spit out the nymphs and midges, all the flies we needed for imitating, and then presenting, as if no lines or hooks attached, to the laughing stream, a parody of the actual thing. And actually, this time the fish rose, the rod tip bent, and Father, let me teach you now what laughter has meant for me, forgiveness, which is release. Now that was breathless, wasn't it? Why did that seem so incredibly breathless? Does it have to do with the form? Does it have to do with the enjambments? Look at it technically, what's happening here. How is this poem functioning on the level of syntax?
All one sentence.
It's all one sentence, yeah. It's rammed in there. No period, good. And is that a detriment, or is that, for a poem like this, it becomes breathless, right? It does become immediate, even though it's being spoken or it's being represented in the past. he showed me how to pump the trout's stomach. So maybe we have the immediacy of a mature speaker looking back, and it is that one gasping breath, right? That purging, and that purging of something physical too. And then let's think about the irony or the paradox of seeing this fish as if it's laughing in a silent film, but in actuality, what's really happening here? What's that, Sophia?
It's vomiting.
Yeah, and it's not just vomiting because it's sick. Why is it vomiting?
It's being forced.
It's being forced to vomit up, is to expel everything in its stomach after it's been brought out of the water, right? So it's already suffering, if we can say that. I mean, I'm a avid fisherman and have been all my life, and I know that fish don't have the same pain receptors that we do. They don't feel pain in the same way we do, but they don't like being out of the water, you know? And that gasping does to us, or should evoke to us, some human trauma, right? But someone who sees it as a kind of laughing, almost like laughter in a silent film, that's troubling, isn't it? I mean, we read right through it. A lot of times we read right through it too because it's a fish and not a mammal. If it would have been a mammal, something warm-blooded, I think that we'd be more disturbed. But we're just accustomed to thinking that fish are dumb animals, that they're low on the great chain of being for some reason. That soundless gasping prompted when my father showed me how to pump the trout's stomach. You see how we've got the same problem that we had in the last poem? The title and a line in the poem are almost exactly the same. There's a redundancy there. And there's a reason to be redundant in poems sometimes, to repeat yourselves. This is not one. Where would you want it to reside, though? That's what we have to think about as writers. And when we're making our own poem that's going to be influenced by a poem like this, and this anxiety of influence that Bloom talks about. When we have a pumping of the trout's stomach, do we want that in the title? Or do we like it there in that rambling that's delayed? I love that the father is delayed, like the they is delayed in the last poem, right? I think that's a smart move. You don't say they or she did this in the beginning of a poem, especially if you're going to find a way to accentuate that human element or the human drama with something else. You bring out that other first, and then you allow that other to conform itself, and maybe even through negative space, create that human presence where we just imagine it being there, or it just kind of surfaces on its own. I would suggest that we need a new title. This is one of those titles that it's just a placeholder. You know, it's just about the contents, really. Pumping the trout's stomach doesn't even really resonate any kind of figurative implications, does it?
But it does get your curiosity. If you hadn't read the poem, you didn't know anything of the whole story, that line actually makes you go, what is that about? And it does
create intrigue,
beckon you in.
Maybe there's another way that we could say it, or there's another way that we could express a localized detail of that pumping the trout's stomach. I love just starting out with almost like laughter in a silent film, so that you start with a tenuous or near simile, right? It's not like this, it's almost like this. You know, it's through those kinds of constructions, those qualifications, that we create uniqueness in those first lines and intrigue. Why isn't it like it? Why is it almost like it? What distinguishes that from the other? That soundless gasping. And then we have those two, almost like laughter in a silent film, which we think, that should be pleasing, but it's disturbing to us because we have talkies, right? So seeing someone trying to laugh and hearing nothing, that's disturbing to us, or it is to me, like a mine is, which scares the shit out of me. That soundless gasping. And that seems more traumatic, right? Prompted when, and prompted then shows what? An active presence, an agent that's doing it, right? Prompted. It's prompted by something else. When, and you see that radical line break there, when my father, and then my father comes after that white space in those short lines. We're finally given that. Showed me how, and then the instruction comes in. And this becomes a father-son or a father-child poem. How to pump. And we're still stuck. We don't know what that is. That's what I don't like about the title is when it says how to pump, what a great line break. But because I've already read Pumping the Trout's Stomach, I know what's going to follow it. How to pump the trout's stomach. So with each laugh, the fish spit out the nymphs and midges, all the flies we needed for imitating and then presenting. So why are you doing it? Just to catch more fish, right? So you're traumatizing and torturing this fish to make it spit up so you can see how you can catch other fish. You can see what is their appetite, right? What is the nature of their appetites? What was their pleasure that day? Because trout fishing is like that, right? You look for the hatch, right? But there might be many hatches, but there might be a reason that they're on that one particular hatch for that one particular day. And they're not like us. They're not like, oh, I'd rather have avocado today instead of asparagus spear. That's not what they think. Oh, I'd rather have my lamb chop today than my ribeye marbled. No, they're not thinking that. Imitating and then presenting as if no lines or hooks attached to the laughing stream, a parody of the actual thing. And actually, this time, the fish rose, the rod tip bent, and father, and then there's the chiasmus here. Y'all know what chiasmus is? It's a literary term. We've got, think of an X, right? And think of a narrative where you have maybe two characters, right? And you've got one, and we'll just say in a very simple scenario, in a very simple equation, you've got the hero and you've got the villain here. And then at the end of the story, they swap and the hero becomes the villain and the villain becomes the hero. It's a Greek term. It's a Greek dramatic term for a turn that happens in a play where you have someone who's ended up somewhere else, exactly opposite from where they started. And the person on the other side, whether the nemesis or whether someone in a relationship has then ended up on the other side too. It's usually about a power struggle. You see it in Shakespeare constantly. Let me teach you. And you see now how that didacticism goes over so that you have now the son teaching the father, even though the father isn't there, right? So it's a wish that this son could do it. So it's an adult speaker looking back at childhood, a childhood memory, and then thinking about, I wish that I could have done this. Let me teach you now what laughter has meant for me. And we get a sense of what laughter means for this character from the beginning, right? If you read it really closely. Laughter in a silent film, that soundless gasping. I mean, imagine someone who sees laughing and thinks soundless gasping. That's someone who has to do what? Find humor in trauma, which is expressed through this fish. Has meant for me forgiveness. And that forgiveness is what? Directed at the father. We don't see any abuse. We don't see any trauma. We don't see anything. It is in that nuance, that wonderful ambiguity there at the end. Forgiveness, which is release. And do you see there the release? So what are we thinking then? How does that literally work in this poem about trout? He's not going to pump the stomach of this next trout. He's going to do what? Release it. See? So this cycle of trauma, this cycle of, or this didacticism of torture, again, it resides within this thing that we would think would be a wonderful experience, right? A father-son fishing trip, right? Where where the father's teaching the son how to catch more fish. But underlying that, we know that there's something darker there. And we know that at the very end. And I don't think that it's hyperbolic. I don't think that it's one of these, that's a great title suggestion. What's that, Ashley?
Sophia's title suggestion was throwing up laughter.
Yeah, something like that. Puking, no, puking's too rough. But I mean, there's something in that. And this whole book is about laughter and humor. And it's about finding humor in trauma, which is the only way to survive. And he becomes a kind of festy character here from Twelfth Night. And that's actually the epigraph for the entire book of poetry, is from Festi. I'll read it to you. And the title of the book is Ballyhoo, which we know what ballyhoo is, but it's also a bait fish. Viola, thy reason, man? Clown, troth, sir, I can yield you none without words, and words are grown so false I am loath to prove reason with them. Viola, I warrant thou art a merry fellow and carest for nothing. And it's true. So let's talk about a poem like this. It's a spare poem. It's a poem that's voice driven, right? It's voice driven in a memory. What are some of the primary images that we have? The nymphs and midges, the flies, and the fish itself gasping, right? And in the simile itself, almost like laughter in a silent film. So I'd like for you, how much time do we have left? About 10 minutes? About 6 minutes. I'd like for you to think about a moment that you had in your childhood where you were being taught something. I can remember lying in gravel, working on my dad's old cars, changing out alternators, changing out starters, dropping the oil pan. Hearing these wrenches clank around him showing me things, but at the same time furious with me because I was 13 and didn't want to be anywhere around that. So I want you to think about a parallel experience that you've had where you have been instructed by someone. It could be anything from an old music teacher to a grandmother showing you how to shell peas or how to pickle beets. It could be about you learning to clip your nails, to buff them. Could be about the first time that I have a poem about playing with tampons. It could be the first time that someone learns about the nature of a tampon and its use. I mean, it's uncomfortable for me to even say, so I imagine it's uncomfortable for people to go through. My 13-year-old daughter, we're starting to talk to her about it, and I'm not even sure, except that I know more about tampons than just about anyone because I had to research the hell out of them for the poem. And I want you to start off your line with an almost simile, kind of like he did. So a qualified simile. Don't say almost like something, but delay the mother, the father, the sister, the brother, the music teacher, the farmer, the landscaper. Maybe it's something that where you were an apprentice for work. Could be about peeling potatoes or playing Yahtzee. But the purpose here, more than anything, is to delay that agent of instruction. And hopefully, like Hastings does, the simile will color the way that we see that agent when that agent first comes in. The silent film, and then the gasping, and then the father. So that we have inherent conflict through imagery outside of what we say, but through a metaphor that's related to something else. All right, who has an opening to share? A doorway, a porthole, a chipmunk hole.
I do.
Thank you, Ashley. And then Sophia, you can come in. Share with us, Ashley.
It's just one line, but I have, or well, actually it's 3 lines, but it's just one little thing. It's like an ant without, like an ant without order, stay put, but I never did.
Okay, now I want you to qualify before the like. So you see the almost, I want you to come up with something, but not almost, that qualifies it, that kinks it a little bit, that breaks down that structural integrity of the simile so that it's a near simile. It's not quite a simile. All right, Sophia, how about you?
I was not like the others. It was so easy for them to skip, to watch, to learn, an easy thing. But their mothers had 2 legs and could.
I like the delay, definitely, but their mothers had 2 legs and could. The first bit seems a little overwritten, but I like it quite a bit. I'd love also, for those of you who are giving me examples, to pause at the line breaks, because I want you to think about the impact of shorter lines, and enjambments through those shorter lines, how we're given one meaning through a line, and then in that delay, when we finish that syntax, we're given an entirely different notion sometimes, like almost like laughter in a silence film, that soundless gasping. This seems so contradictory, but they ring true. Who else has something?
Almost gunfire at Fort Sumter, the strange strangled truth when.
Good. And stopping it when?
Yeah, I mean, I did go on, but.
Yeah. When, and then were you going to introduce the agent?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
The Southern 7th grade teacher.
Yeah, I mean, the when there too, with a subordinating clause like that, and then, relegating that teacher. And again, we've got to think about parts of speech. Relegation happens in syntax and it happens in parts of speech. When I talked about earlier, the way you can relegate someone to the object of a preposition, you can take them out of that interior landscape of the sentence that's so important. and you can relegate them to that or relegate them to a subordinating clause. So there is that delay there. There is something implicit and psychological in the reasons that we do such a thing, that we wouldn't start out with an ordinary or a traditional student with a traditional sentence with a subject verb, where we're delaying everything and we've given that power to something else, and then we've relegated this this agent that we're going to bring up later that has had the impact on the speaker. Oh, I see so many of my friends in here now. I couldn't see all of you before. Rachel and Layla and Shelley and Allison. Wow. Who else has something? Taylor? Rachel? All right, I think we're about out of time anyway. But this is just an exercise with two poems that I've always admired, and two poems from people that I adore and adored, and go to often. Go to their poems often when I'm stuck. However, you've got to be a discerning critic also. You can't just fall in love with the poems, and it's, you know, and our influence models sometimes are not just about taking the poem as it is, but sometimes it's about, you know, a reckoning. It's about digging into that poem and finding fault with it. And in finding that fault, sometimes we open doors into our own poems. Well, thank you so much for coming. It's good to see all my friends, and I'll stick around for a little bit if people want to ask me any questions or throw things at me virtually.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Adam, for joining us. I really appreciate your workshop with all of you in attendance. So we're going to take probably about 4 or 5 minute break real quick, just to sort of reset things, and then we'll be back with another workshop.